It's my pleasure to be introducing the first session of the APT9 Symposium, entitled Connectivities, Conditions for Contemporary Art in Spaces of Trans-Regionality. This topic has been conceived to raise some questions about how contemporary art can be framed in terms of certain ideas of regional definitions and boundaries, and particular how such definitions in the Asia-Pacific may be active in a range of fields of discourse, including that of contemporary art. The idea has particular relevance for the Asia-Pacific triennial by definition, and APT9 includes works by artists that both look to older artistic relationships between regions, nations, islands and communities, as well as works which unveil the changing power structures operating both within the art world and further afield, which not only create new dialogues, opportunities and perspectives, but also reveal divisions. Here we can consider movements, relations, interactions and barriers across place, time and context, and geopolitical conditions that are influencing the mobility and activities for contemporary artists. To reflect on how relations and exchanges are influencing practice and art histories, and to see how connectivities can be productive for the past, present and future for artists and audiences. A major concern for contemporary art emerging from Australia, Asia and the Pacific is how it might be exhibited, discussed and contextualised in other regions, particularly those closer to the Western art centres. This session will begin with a paper by MuHKA, who will address some of the implications of these questions informed by his own experiences. Nav is Senior Curator of the Museum of Contemporary Art, Antwerp, and we're very happy to have him today as one of our international visitors. And Nav will touch on how the Museum of Contemporary Art, Antwerp, came to position itself as a Eurasian museum, advocating for a greater connectivity between Asia and Europe, acknowledging the contentiousness nature of the term Eurasia, in its historical and contemporary uses, and also exploring how the idea of Eurasia has been picked up in the artistic context. We're hoping for a few minutes for questions following Nav's paper, provided we all run on time, before we lead into a panel discussion for this paper, which will breach this subject from a range of other angles, including those from Australia, Asia and the Pacific. So my great pleasure to introduce MuHKA.
Thank you, Tarun, for the introduction. Thank you to QAGOMA for the invitation to speak today. It's very nice to see so many people, especially on a Monday morning. I'd like to start, I suppose, with a very, very small caveat, which is to say that it's my first time in Australia, in this region. I think in the beginning, when they invited me, there was a question around whether I could talk about Asia-Pacific, but the thing is I would be the wrong person because I don't know anything about this particular sphere. And my suggestion was to maybe talk about something else that would be a little bit more familiar to me, which very much connects to the work I do in Antwerp, where I'm based in Belgium. So there is, I'm very aware, a sort of a high level of risk that what I'm going to talk a little bit about is completely irrelevant for everybody here. But let's see how we get on. This is just a map that I found. I made a small modification to it, and I'll leave you to guess what might be missing from this. This is the institution where I'm working, the MuHKA, the Museum of Contemporary Art. I don't think I really intend it to be a paper really about the museum, but a lot of our sort of interest there has led to ourselves increasingly describing ourselves as a Eurasian museum. We do it in an informal way rather than in a formalized sense, and there are a number of reasons for this. Very much to do with our engagements through our programming, through our collecting. We have a lot of engagement, for example, with a lot of the former member states of the Soviet Union. We worked a lot with artists from Central Asia, Caucasus region, as well as Russia, for example. This has been over sort of a period of many years, decades, together with engagements with parts of Middle East and across Asia as well. It's not really been sort of come out of strong or clear policy decisions. I would say it's sort of happened in a naturalized way. So we wouldn't really describe it as being ideological, but maybe even partially pragmatic. Maybe it's a bit too ambitious to say you're a global museum, and so that you can have sort of particular focus. Maybe in that regard, the idea of Asia Pacific, there are some similarities. If we use this word Eurasia, it's an old term with many cultural, political, even tectonic connotations and contentions. But we might think of it as a futuristic term as well, if we consider how the world and the balance of power is changing. And in our case, in Antwerp, we start to consider ourselves in our museum as a small part of the westernmost point in the province of Eurasia. Just to sort of touch on a few of the understandings of this term, we might as well go all the way back and look at it in a geological one, because we can think of Eurasia as being connected to landmass. Some people describe it as a supercontinent, peninsula that includes regions that we recognize as being Europe and Asia. It's a term that became widely used after 1883, when the Austrian geologist Eduard Suess published his book, The Face of the Earth. Most of the continent is taken up by the Eurasian plate. Of course, not entirely. We can see here the Indian plate, the Arabian plate, and parts of Siberia that are a different plate. And when we start to even talk in archaeological terms of things that are prehistory, the terminology starts to cross over. Very recently, I was sort of struck by an article that I read in The Guardian, really just a couple of weeks ago, about a relatively recent discovery of some rock paintings in the East Kalimantan province of Indonesian Borneo, considered, it seems, amongst some of the oldest figurative paintings. They seem to date it at around 40,000 years ago, and there's some sort of contentions around this dating. But I was quite taken aback by this particular sort of part of the article that I was reading. Of course, he very much sort of states that he's talking about at face value, so without really necessarily understanding the meanings of the images, but they are sort of undoubtedly figurative. So you can see sort of images of cattle. So I think to begin with, we talk about Eurasia as a landmass. I'm really going to sort of be making some massive leaps in time and geography during this. Of course, at a certain point, the idea of Europe emerges. A cultural definition of Europe was first used in the 8th century, demarcating the sphere of influence of Latin Christendom, and defined in opposition to what it thinks it isn't, in opposition to the Islamic world and Eastern Orthodox churches. This is just a sort of a small part of the Treaty of Westphalia, which took place in 1648, ending European wars of religion and creating the blueprint for a new political order based on the principle of coexisting sovereign states and national self-determination. So I suppose we see this as a moment where there's a sort of proliferation and often an imposition of the idea of nation state. This is, I suppose, a sort of group photo of that particular moment of signing the treaty. Around 50 years later, the defined borders between Europe and Asia, with the Ural Mountains as the main reference, emerges as the outcome of work done by Philip Johann von Strahlenberg, Swedish-German officer, taken prisoner by Peter the Great after the Swedish defeat at Poltava in 1709. So, you know, it's very easy in the present day to think of regions based on sort of current political constructs. You know, something like Europe, for example, we can think about it as being much beyond the idea what a construct such as the European Union is, for example. There's also a colonial connotation to the word Eurasia and Eurasian. Eurasian was a term used to describe an identification of a person of mixed race, of both European and South Asian extraction in India under British rule. Eurasians, though coming to develop their own syncretic culture and belief systems, during this period were often subjected to processes of marginalization by both Indian and British populations in India. Somehow it felt important to talk about the idea of this sort of contentious term as having a colonial and even sort of racial connotation in this sense as well. To move on to certain political connotations. There have been different moments in Russian political and ideological thought that describe themselves as Eurasianism. Even starting, over the last 100 years or so in particular, right up to most recently Russian President Vladimir Putin talking about the harmonious economic community from Lisbon to Vladivostok as a particular image that he has. Russian Eurasianism goes back to the Eurasianists of the 1920s, a particular moment to think about the future of the former Russian Empire, different from its Tsarist past and its Bolshevik present. Most recently, Eurasianism as a school of thought has sort of become popularized again during the years leading up to and following the collapse of the Soviet Union, that considers Russia to be culturally closer to Asia than to Western Europe. Lev Gumilev is often cited as the founder of the Neo-Eurasianist movement. His contribution to Neo-Eurasianism, based on his theory of ethnogenesis, it's a very sort of curious idea that sort of goes back to Mongol occupation of 2040 to 1480, the so-called Mongol yoke, and the related growth of Central Asian tribal culture that actually this sort of proliferation of the Mongolian Empire in a certain way shielded the emergent Russia at that point from the aggression of the neighbors to the west, allowing it to gain time to achieve maturity. So somehow when this sort of, the Mongol Empire was growing, Russia was somehow sort of lying dormant and allowed to sort of, these ideas to flourish as a sort of Eurasian superstate. But there are also other neo-Eurasianists in the Russian Federation. I think another sort of prominent one right now is based around thinkings of the right-wing thinker Alexander Dugin. He founded the Eurasia Party in 2002, defining itself through a rejection of Atlanticism, future-oriented, Russia-centric, but you might describe it as being more closely aligned with fascism. This is the flag of the Eurasia Party. It's quite unsubtle, I would say. And I'm going to talk about another sort of representation of Eurasia that I'd sort of forgotten about, but I'm happy to have sort of remembered it recently. This is a map of the world in George Orwell's 1984, where we see the world as basically has three superstates that emerged in the 20-year period following the end of World War II, out of nuclear war and societal collapse. It's basically stated that Eurasia was formed when the Soviet Union annexed the rest of continental Europe, creating a single polity stretching from Portugal to the Bering Strait. So there is the sort of the yellowish area, the disputed region, that has its corners in the book described as being from Tangier to Brazzaville, Darwin, and Hong Kong. And this is the sort of region where it's sort of like the battlegrounds. People are subordinate. And so that they have no particular allegiance in this area. They just have to sort of deal with sort of perpetual war, slavery. And I just thought it was kind of an interesting thing to throw into the mix. The depictions of Eurasian people in the book are pretty much always in Oceania. The representation of Eurasians is always of Mongol people. Despite the fact, of course, it stretches all the way from Western Europe all the way across to Siberia, Mongolia. It's always a representation of a Mongol soldier. So there's sort of a perpetuating something that becomes a kind of racist stereotype and a sort of image of otherness that you're at war with. Now, after some gigantic leaps in time and in geography, I'll bring us now to some examples of artistic practice. 2 or 3 examples of artists that we have made exhibitions of and have collected as part of our, to become part of our collection in the museum in Antwerp. Jimmy Durham is one. The notion of Eurasia is very much present in a lot of his work. In his case, primarily as a way to unpack the idea of Europe. This is the work, Eurasia Ascent, that we have as part of our collection, that he made as part of a research trip to Siberia in the 90s. Another example would be Hussein Bari Alptekin, an artist who was very much prominent in the 80s and 90s in the art scene of Istanbul. One of the people you might say was responsible for actually helping Istanbul become a very established artistic scene on an international level, and one of the sort of first artists to really sort of work internationally. This is one of his earliest works, inspired by Joseph Beuys. And I think it could well be from Beuys, but maybe for other reasons that the idea of Eurasia becomes also quite prominent in his work. Alptekin was also very much interested in sort of globalization and branding. So he's sort of adopted the J and the B from the whiskey brand. The same initials as Joseph Beuys. Alptekin, we could say, was also very influenced by globalization, the free movement of people and objects. In the context of Turkey, the different kinds of feral forms of trade that were starting to emerge after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where certain kinds of objects were starting to appear in the market, in the everyday. This is one of my favorite works of his. It's called Global Digestion, that he developed over a long period of time. He was traveling a lot. When he was on his travels, every time he went to the toilet, he took a picture. I think he became eventually quite, he was doing this partly for research, also partly through sort of paid work. He was working as a freelance photographer at a certain point. He became quite influenced by Zizek's book, The Plague of Fantasies, in which he discusses the specificities of visiting the toilet for people of different cultures. And I think he became interested in his experience of what he saw, that even one of the most basic functions of the human body is not necessarily a universal experience. And I'm quite interested in this as a really curious sort of field research. And in a certain way, a sort of mapping also. In this case, not specifically directly connected to Eurasia. He was also traveling to different countries across Africa, for example. But it gives you a sense of sort of a certain kind of perspective that he had on sort of things being opened up to the world somehow. He had a plan to set up a project called the Sea Elephant Travel Agency. Of course, this is part of a sort of a larger project he did to do with the Black Sea and the different sort of places surrounding all around the Black Sea. A project that was inspired by Jules Verne's book, Caravan, the Inflexible. And he actually had an idea to develop a sort of, almost like a sort of floating think tank, to sort of set off on a boat and with a group of people, all from different fields, artists, scientists, different kinds of thinkers, to sort of circumnavigate the Black Sea and to eventually end up back in Istanbul, traveling around Bulgaria, Sevastopol, Sochi, Armenia, all the way around. In the end, it was actually a failed project. It didn't materialize, but the idea stuck with him. And I think it's also his way of sort of looking, wanting to sort of, in a very sort of curious way, to reflect on the sort of diversity of culture around the Black Sea. Crimea, of course, has become sort of topical again after annexation. It's also the place where Joseph Beuys was alleged to have had his plane crash, rescued by the Crimean Tatar people. I suppose the most recent example for us is actually Joseph Beuys. I organised an exhibition about a year ago on the work of Joseph Beuys. There were different sort of motivations for this. One was the fact that he was very active in Antwerp and Belgium, Netherlands, Rhineland region in the 60s and 70s. And one of the core notions in his work that reappeared in his work from the beginning through to the end was the notion of Eurasia. He used it to problematize the separation between notions of East and West and to seek a sort of reconciliation. He understood Eurasia as an open space without physical or ideological boundaries. You might even say that the notion of Eurasia is part of his anti-modern worldview, looking away from the West, from America as a dominant force of modernity and hegemony. In that sense, you might say he's also sort of against the sort of the axis of Atlanticism. He was working against the logic and hegemony of modernism. He was, in a certain sense, the embodiment of the anti-modern. You know, he was always talking about different forms of reconciliation, the reconciliation of rationality and intuition. He would talk about the idea of there being sort of deep wounds, which are partly informed by the experience of war, but also sort of this, what he understood as being a split in the sort of the emergence of the split between sort of intuition and rationality. In 1963, he founded the first of actually several political parties. The first party he set up was the Eurasia Party in '63. Subsequently, there was the Student Party, the Party for Animals, maybe most visibly the Green Party, which of course still exists, and actually at this moment in time doing actually particularly well in different regional elections in Germany. So it sort of recurred in his work over decades, also in key performances like you see here in Eurasia Siberian Symphony. The hair appears in a lot of his work. So for different reasons. It's a sort of symbolism, an old symbol for intelligence, but also because somehow it's to do with like freedom of movement, sort of movement through the landscape without any hindrance. Some of the sort of typical materials that he's using, you can see here the animal fat, the felt. Another important symbol here, you can see the sort of the geometric shape at the top. It's a half cross. Of course, he's often using the cross, what looks like sort of the Greek-style cross, but often it's the half cross because it's his way of trying to, it's like a cross folded in half. So it's about East and West again, reconnecting. There's also the work Eurasian Staff that he made together with Henning Christiansen. The second iteration was in 1968 at the Wide White Space in Antwerp, a pioneering space before really public institutions existed, which is a performance that he did that is about what he calls the Eurasian Staff, something, it's a particular story to do with people going to the Holy Land, the monotheistic Holy Land in Jerusalem, bringing back the Eurasian Staff. And so this idea of bringing something from the East and bringing it to the West. And of course, the staff, it has a sort of ambiguous presence in Beuys's work. It's of course, staff is something used by the shaman, but it's also the shepherd, it's the priest alike. Yeah, so the Eurasian staff appears sort of again and again in a lot of his work. Often the walking stick is used as a sort of surrogate of the staff. He had an ongoing collaboration with Namjoon Paik. Their collaboration actually had the name Eurasia. Both, of course, from countries at either end of Eurasia, but actually what's maybe interesting is that sort of more or less around a similar point in history, countries that went through a partition. So, you know, perhaps even sort of this notion of Eurasia is a way to sort of mentally address cultural separation, isolation as well. Yeah, so he even described himself as a Eurasian. Der Eurasia lässt schon grüßen. I suppose you might describe that as greetings from the Eurasian. Also, the figure of Genghis Khan, from the sort of the early days of his work, is very sort of interested in the figure of Genghis Khan. Of course, in a lot of the world, in Europe, he's sort of demonized as the invader. But I think Beuys wanted to bring more complexity to the figure of Genghis Khan. You know, even sort of understanding that even as part of the empire, there were instances where he supported the coexistence of different communities and different belief systems. Genghis Khan and the sort of the story of Genghis Khan appears really like again and again, beginning through to the end in his career. Trans-Sibirische Bahn, the performance Trans-Sibirische Bahn, Trans-Siberian Railway. He was interested in this sort of the railway because of the movement of people from one end of Eurasia to the other. Looking particularly bling with his fur coat. I think also Beuys was attempting to understand what it means to be subaltern. And of course, subaltern is one of these words that also has colonial connotations, but not necessarily always. In critical theory, it's used to describe a more sort of emancipatory mode, to talk about people outside of modern hegemonic power. I think he was quite interested in the idea of the subaltern, because he was always interested in addressing civic relations of power, always trying to identify with those beyond the self-image of the West, as seen even in his approach to politics, education, as well as his art, his way of making art through ritualized actions, the relationship to materials, to nature, often sort of subjected to decay, degradation. Now, I say all of this. It also feels legitimate to say that there is also a certain Orientalism to Beuys's perception towards the East. This sort of land of intuition in opposition to rationality. We could see that as being quite simplistic. It's a perception of Asia from someone looking from afar across the huge landmass. And it's actually important to note that, yeah, sure, okay, I'll be quick. That actually Beuys only ever went to Asia once, very, very late in his life in '84, when he went to Japan for 8 days, 2 years before his death. Did a performance with Namjoon Paik. Most bizarrely, he made this advert for a whiskey brand.
美味しいウイスキーを知っています。スーパー日課。
I don't know if Alptekin had knowledge of this when he made his JB work, but it's kind of a bizarre thing. Okay, so I should probably speed up a bit. But I suppose, despite this, we can sort of, I think, take something from Boyce, particularly in its attempt to reconcile notions of self and other, and sort of seeing Eurasia as a vast territory with a plurality of culture, understanding that a Eurasian is anybody from the peninsula of Eurasia. A Rhinelander is a Eurasian, a Mongol is a Eurasian, a Crimean Tatar is a Eurasian, just as a Fleming is a Eurasian. I'll skip all of this. And I sort of wanted to throw this last image in because it somehow felt important in relation to this notion of Eurasia, China's reimagining of the Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative. And I was quite interested in the fact that there's one particular economic corridor, the New Eurasia Land Bridge Economic Corridor, that actually goes all the way right into Duisburg in the Rhineland, this particular region where the Westphalia Treaty was signed, where Boyce was from. Somehow felt important to sort of see that where this actually ends up. So I suppose the reason I gave a bit of a very sort of anecdotal, maybe even lackadaisical history lesson before leading into Boyce is because there is an attempt towards a sort of conciliation between different things. There is a sort of conciliation even with prehistory, thinking about land before political borders. With the self-image of Europe and the nation-state, he looked against Eurocentricity and border constructs. In relation to coloniality, there was seeking affinity with subalternity. With politics, seeking equality and coexistence in opposition to fascism. I quite like the fact that he's rethinking the Atlanticist worldview. Eurasia is a contested notion, but despite obvious problems, I'm quite interested in Boyce's emphasis on culture over geopolitics, believing that there can be positive cultural ramifications to Eurasia and for Eurasians, all in the name of freedom and creativity, which are, again, sort of key notions in the work of Boyce. Freedom of movement, freedom of creativity, and I understand these to be sort of key notions for this particular conference as well. And of course, this notion of Eurasia doesn't need to be hegemonic. Other axes can sit alongside it, or overlap with it, or sit within it. I suppose, going back to my very first slide where I erased something, there might be some questions around the relationship of the Anglo-Saxon world in this sphere. And yeah, and I think I just wanted to talk about these sort of notions, raise these sort of notions of freedom and creativity at the level of ideas, rather than purely about other sort of pragmatic factors such as funding, politics.